The Legend of Zelda has been one of my favorite video game franchises for almost a decade. It's a series I started playing in my teenage years, when the idea of being in a mythical fantasy was the best escape from the real world I could have asked for. It's a very important series to me, and it introduced me to what is still to this day one of my two favorite games of all time in The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. With all of that being said, you likely wouldn't be surprised to hear I was excited for Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity when it was announced back in September. For those who are unfamiliar with Zelda, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity is a game that kind of serves two different roles. First, as a follow-up to the spin-off game Hyrule Warriors, which originally released in 2014 on the Wii U, and has since seen ports on both the 3DS in 2016 and the Switch in 2018. And second, as a prequel of sorts to the most recent mainline entry into the series, The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild, which released back in 2017 for both the Wii U and Switch. Both aspects of Age of Calamity were incredibly exciting to me, as I adored the original Hyrule Warriors and have put a lot of time into it between all three versions. And while I found Breath of the Wild a bit disappointing for reasons that I'll get to later, one aspect I loved about the game was whenever we would learn about the events prior to the actual game itself. So now that Age of Calamity is out, and I've had the chance to play through it, I decided to make this video about it, as this game really reminded me what it is that made me fall in love with the Zelda series in the first place. Age of Calamity at its core is a blending of Hyrule Warriors and Breath of the Wild, and that's something that rings true in almost every aspect of its design. The most apparent way is in the game's visuals, so I think I'll talk about the game's presentation first. Now, I'm not much of a graphics person, but even I can appreciate how much effort the developers put into making this game mimic the now iconic art style of Breath of the Wild so closely. There's just something so immensely enjoyable about seeing these areas from Breath of the Wild 100 years in the past. The game looks great, both on the TV and in handheld mode. The game's performance, on the other hand, is not as consistent. The game will suffer from frame rate drops depending on what level you're playing and what's going on screen. While that's not unheard of for a Musou game on Switch, I've seen similar issues in the Switch version of One Piece Pirate Warriors 4, it would have been nice if it could have been more consistent across the board. It's nothing too unbearable, at least in single player, but for those of you who are more averse to inconsistent frame rates, it might be an issue. As for me, frame rates aren't too big of a concern, especially Musou games, so it didn't bother me too much. As for the cutscenes, they're absolutely on par with, if not better than Breath of the Wild, which is great to see given there's so much more of them in Age of Calamity. The English voice acting is also on par with, if not better than Breath of the Wild in my opinion. I know that the voice acting in Breath of the Wild was a bit hit or miss for some, but I enjoyed it, and in Age of Calamity it continues to be fantastic. All of the actors, both returning and new, did a great job portraying their characters. It was great to hear voice actors I'm more familiar with outside of Zelda, namely Sean Chiplock and Elizabeth Maxwell, return for their roles as Revali and Urbosa respectively, and once again knock it out of the park.
About this pathetic knight in your service, are you sure he's got what it takes?
No longer, I say. I will pilot this divine beast. You are precious to me, and you need my help. I cannot refuse.
That being said, the standout for me is absolutely Patricia Summersett as Zelda. She did a great job in Breath of the Wild, and her work here was phenomenal.
If I don't succeed at sealing the calamity, never. This will not come to pass.
Zelda was a lot more prominent in this game than she was in Breath of the Wild, and Patricia really rose to the occasion, which was great to see. The last aspect of presentation I want to talk about is the music, which, as my username might imply, is a pretty important aspect of any game to me. Now, the original Hyrule Warriors, as a celebration of the entire Zelda series, took a lot of the iconic songs from across the series' legacy and gave it a rock spin to go more in line with the action-focused gameplay. Conversely, Age of Calamity, as a more direct tie-in to one game, leans into Breath of the Wild's score. Which is an interesting choice considering how minimalist Breath of the Wild's use of music was. It absolutely was the right choice though, as Breath of the Wild's soundtrack, while minimal in-game, has some stellar compositions throughout. The soundtrack just needed some new arrangements to give it more oomph for a Musou game, and that's exactly what composers Kumi Tanioka, Ryo Uratani, Ryotaro Yagi, and Haruki Yamada did for Age of Calamity. This can be seen as early as the first level of the game, which is a more bombastic rearrangement of the field battle theme from Breath of the Wild. I don't think there's a song that highlights this musical transition from Breath of the Wild to Age of Calamity better than one of my favorite tracks from both games, Mipha's theme. It's wonderful as a fan of Breath of the Wild's soundtrack to hear these new arrangements. Some of my other favorite tracks include Rivali's battle theme, the enemy outpost version of Searching the Lost Woods, a song I can't mention because of spoilers, and all of the tracks that use the classic melody of Zelda's Lullaby as their main motif. Man, the way this game uses Zelda's Lullaby is just fantastic. It's such an enduring theme for the series as a whole that I'm incredibly impressed this game found a new way to use it, almost 30 years after its debut in A Link to the Past. With all that rambling, I think it's safe to say I enjoyed this game's soundtrack quite a lot, and I must commend the team of composers that made it all possible. Now that I've spent so much time gushing over the soundtrack, I think it's time to talk about the gameplay. Unlike the presentation, which is clearly trying to emulate Breath of the Wild, the gameplay of Age of Calamity is more of a middle ground between the combat of Breath of the Wild and the typical Musou gameplay of the original Hyrule Warriors. Obviously, as a Musou game, there are some aspects of the gameplay that is to be expected. Action combat, large amounts of enemies, varied roster of playable characters, it's all there. Where this game really differs is how it incorporates elements of Breath of the Wild into the combat, such as the Sheikah Slate runes, the Flurry Rush, and a shield parry for characters with a shield. These Breath of the Wild mechanics not only help set Age of Calamity apart from other Musou games, it even helps it feel different compared to the original Hyrule Warriors, which leaned into other Zelda series tropes like inventory items and the magic meter. This really helps to sell Age of Calamity as a spin-off to Breath of the Wild specifically, which adds a lot to the vibe the game was clearly going for with the presentation and story. To get even more granular, I think Age of Calamity has a fantastic cast of playable characters. Both the unique action and variation in how each character uses the Sheikah Slate runes adds so much to make each character feel unique. That variety in character playstyles is incredibly important, especially once you realize this game's roster is significantly smaller than the Switch version of the original Hyrule Warriors. That being said, the original Hyrule Warriors also had some clunkers in the roster, so there's definitely an argument to be made that Age of Calamity has quality over quantity, and I'm inclined to agree. One way I'm less likely to agree with the quality over quantity argument is the severe lack of extra content in Age of Calamity compared to the original Hyrule Warriors, especially that game's Switch version. The original Hyrule Warriors is a game that I've put over 100 hours into the Switch version alone, and I still find myself going back to it to this day. On the other hand, at the time of writing this script, I'm about 60 hours into Age of Calamity and I already have about 90% completion, and that's honestly incredibly disappointing to me. Musou games are the types of experiences I love to revisit from time to time, with a lot of gameplay to sink my teeth into, and I was really hoping to add Age of Calamity to that rotation, but I'll likely complete it before I really get the chance to do so. Another quick complaint for me is the Divine Beast levels. I groaned every time one appeared on the map, especially as they got more difficult further in the game, as I'd much rather be playing a more traditional Musou stage. It seems like the design philosophy around this game's content was quite different to the original Hyrule Warriors. In that game, the main story felt more like a nice introduction to the gameplay that really felt like it got going once the main story wrapped up, with the wealth of optional content for you to dig into. With Age of Calamity, it seemed like the focus this time was on that main story, with the game streamlining the side content as part of the main campaign, but only leaving some of it locked behind the credits. I think both approaches have their merits, and while I wish there was more content in the game, that's hopefully what potential future DLC will be for. So if Age of Calamity's structure is designed to prop up its story, then hopefully that story would be an enjoyable one. The story, characters, and world building was the part of this game I was the most excited about leading up to its release. Admittedly, a lot of this excitement came from how disappointing Breath of the Wild was in this department for me, especially compared to previous games in the Zelda series. Breath of the Wild built such an interesting world with a cool history, but so much of those neat story, lore, and character aspects took a massive backseat to the large world and wildly different gameplay. As someone whose favorite part of Zelda games tends to be those story and lore aspects of the series, it left the whole experience feeling a bit hollow for me when I played Breath of the Wild back in 2017. In comes Age of Calamity, a game marketed as a prequel to Breath of the Wild that contextualizes Link's memories from that original game. Link's memories and the few lore dumps were some of my favorite parts of Breath of the Wild, so a whole game with that as the foundation of its story could really help add to my appreciation of Breath of the Wild's world. And I'm happy to report that Age of Calamity absolutely succeeds in this regard. Without getting into spoilers, I will say that the story was definitely not what I expected going into the game, but the story in the game we ended up with was immensely enjoyable. Seeing at least some of the reaction to it on the internet, I know not everyone feels that way, and I can understand why, but for me, this story is not only better than the original Breath of the Wild, I would go out and say that Age of Calamity's story is one of my favorites in the entire Zelda series. If there's one major issue I have with it, it would be the villain Astor, who is pretty forgettable, but otherwise, the story is elevated by a fun cast of characters. The champions, Purah, Robbie, the King, Impa, Link, they're all great, but the standout in my opinion is Zelda. I knew I liked this incarnation of Zelda when playing Breath of the Wild, but Age of Calamity solidified her as my favorite Zelda in the entire series. This is her story, and watching her journey over the course of the game was an absolute treat from beginning to end. I don't think it can be understated how much Age of Calamity has added to my appreciation of this world, and I do genuinely believe if I revisit Breath of the Wild at some point, I will appreciate it infinitely more having experienced this game. So I think it's about time to start wrapping things up. While it's far from perfect, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity is a fantastic game that I would recommend any Zelda fan play. It was an immensely enjoyable experience that reinvigorated my love for the franchise. The future of The Legend of Zelda looks bright, and I eagerly anticipate what Breath of the Wild's follow-up has in store for us whenever we finally see more of that game. That said, I've been Casual Music Nerd, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to give it a like and let me know your thoughts on Age of Calamity in the comments. If you want to know when the next video releases, make sure to hit that subscribe button. If you'd like to hear more from me, make sure to follow me on Twitter, link in the description. Anyway, I hope you all have a fantastic day, and I'll see you next time.